There are pages of history torn out, burned, and buried. Hidden beneath layers of patriotic pride, polished textbooks, and smiling portraits of so-called heroes. But behind the curtain of what you were taught in school lies something far more sinister. This isn't the history of dates and flags. This is the history of secrets, of forgotten massacres, medical horrors, and government betrayals. A legacy of cruelty masked as progress, of horror hidden in plain sight. Tonight, we open the door they tried to keep locked. These are the dark facts they never wanted you to know. Welcome to Dark History Schools Don't Teach You, if you dare to remember. The truth about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. For 40 years, the U.S. Public Health Service conducted a medical study on African American men with syphilis without their informed consent. These men were promised free health care but were left untreated even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s. The goal was to observe the natural progression of the disease, but this came at a devastating human cost. This dark chapter exposes the systemic racism embedded in American healthcare and scientific research. The men suffered unnecessarily, spreading the disease to their families and dying from preventable complications. The study only ended after a whistleblower exposed it in 1972, sparking outrage nationwide. This story reveals how institutions abused their power and betrayed vulnerable populations under the guise of science. It's a haunting reminder of why medical ethics and patient rights are essential and why such atrocities must never be forgotten or repeated. The real history behind Columbus Day. Christopher Columbus is often celebrated as a heroic explorer who discovered America. But the reality is far darker. Upon his arrival, Columbus and his men enslaved, brutalized, and decimated indigenous populations through violence and disease. His arrival marked the beginning of centuries of colonization and genocide. Columbus personally orchestrated acts of cruelty, including mass executions and the enslavement of thousands of Native Americans. Entire civilizations were shattered, and their cultures were nearly erased. The legacy of Columbus Day glosses over this violent past and perpetuates a myth that whitewashes the suffering of indigenous peoples. Many communities now advocate replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day to honor those who were here first and recognize the dark truth behind the so-called discovery. It's a call to rethink history from the perspective of those who endured colonization. How the Opium Wars fueled British imperialism. In the mid-19th century, Britain forced China to accept the trade of opium, a highly addictive drug, leading to widespread addiction and social collapse in China. The British fought two brutal wars known as the Opium Wars to protect their profitable drug trade, using their military might to impose unfair treaties. This dark history exposes the callous exploitation underlying imperialism, where economic gain trumped human suffering. China was forced to cede territory, pay massive reparations, and open ports to foreign control, marking the start of what the Chinese call the Century of Humiliation. Today, the Opium Wars are rarely discussed in Western schools, yet they reveal how drug addiction and imperial greed were weaponized to dominate entire nations and reshape global power. the dark reality behind the myth of the lost cause. After the Civil War, the Southern states propagated the lost cause narrative, which romanticized the Confederacy and justified slavery as a noble institution. This myth downplayed slavery's central role and recast the Confederates as heroes defending states' rights and Southern heritage. This revisionist history fueled systemic racism and segregation, inspiring the rise of Jim Crow laws and white supremacist groups. Monuments and textbooks glorified the Confederacy, misleading generations about the true causes and consequences of the war. Understanding the lost cause is vital to confronting ongoing racial tensions and dismantling the lingering symbols and ideologies that continue to distort American history. The forgotten atrocities of the Philippine-American War. Following the Spanish-American War, the U.S. fought a brutal conflict to suppress the Philippine independence movement. The war included widespread atrocities, mass executions, torture, and concentration camps that killed hundreds of thousands of Filipinos. This chapter of American imperialism is often omitted from school curricula, overshadowed by the narrative of liberating the Philippines from Spain. Instead, the U.S. replaced one colonial master with another, crushing Filipino aspirations for self-rule. Acknowledging this dark history challenges the myth of American benevolence abroad and sheds light on the violent foundations of U.S. overseas expansion. How eugenics shaped U.S. policy. In the early 20th century, eugenics, a pseudoscience aimed at improving the human race through selective breeding, was widely accepted in America. Eugenicists promoted sterilization laws, targeting the disabled, poor, and minority groups, often without consent. Thousands of Americans were forcibly sterilized, their reproductive rights stripped away under the guise of science. These policies reflected deep-seated racism, ableism, and classism, and influenced immigration laws designed to restrict undesirable groups. The dark legacy of eugenics warns us how science can be misused to justify human rights abuses and discrimination masked as progress. The dark history of the Indian residential school. For over a century, Canada and the U.S. operated Indian residential schools aimed at forcibly assimilating indigenous children. Thousands of children were taken from their families, forbidden to speak their languages or practice their cultures, and subjected to abuse and neglect. These schools caused deep trauma and cultural loss, contributing to intergenerational suffering in indigenous communities. The governments long denied or downplayed this history, but survivors' voices have brought these dark truths into the light. This history underscores the ongoing impacts of colonialism and the importance of reconciliation and justice for indigenous peoples. How the transatlantic slave trade fueled Western wealth. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly brought millions of Africans to the Americas in brutal conditions, creating unimaginable suffering. Yet many textbooks gloss over how this system was the backbone of Western economic development. European and American wealth, from plantations to industry, was built on enslaved labor. The profits financed banks, universities, and infrastructure, still benefiting societies today. Recognizing this truth challenges sanitized historical narratives and demands we confront the legacies of slavery embedded in modern institutions.